October 17, 1944. A small town in northern Italy called Pontelongo, 20 kilometers west of Bologna. The autumn rain had turned the narrow streets to mud, and the Germans were losing patience. In the town square, 73 men stood in two ragged lines, their hands bound behind their backs with telephone wire. Some were partisan fighters, others were villagers who had simply been unlucky enough to be male and between the ages of 16 and 60 when the SS arrived at dawn. The distinction no longer mattered. They would all hang by evening. SS-Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber stood on the steps of the municipal building, reviewing the execution order that had come down from division command. The partisan attack 3 days earlier had killed 2 German soldiers and wounded 4 others. Reprisal policy was clear, 10 Italians for every German killed. He had the bodies. He had the rope. He needed only the formality of a trial. But there was a problem. None of Weber's men spoke Italian beyond basic commands. The prisoners spoke no German. And division command, in its infinite bureaucratic wisdom, insisted that charges must be read and understood before sentence was carried out. It was October 1944, the Reich was collapsing on all fronts, but proper procedure still mattered to someone in a headquarters somewhere. Enter Corporal Heinrich Müller, 26 years old, born in Munich to a German father and an Italian mother. He had grown up speaking both languages, working in his father's import business before the war. The Wehrmacht had recognized his linguistic skills early and assigned him to rear echelon duties as a translator. It was safe work, administrative work, the kind of war service that let a man sleep at night. Until October 17. Müller had arrived in Pontelongo that morning with a supply convoy, expecting to spend a few hours processing requisition forms before moving on. Instead, the SS had grabbed him from the convoy and ordered him to the square. He was to translate the charges, translate the prisoner's statements, and translate the sentence. Simple. Straightforward. His duty as a soldier. He looked at the 73 men in the square. Most stared at the ground. A few met his eyes with the kind of defiant silence that means a man has already accepted death. 2 were crying quietly. 1 appeared to be praying. Several were visibly injured from interrogation that had taken place the previous night. The youngest couldn't have been more than 17, a farm boy with dirty blonde hair and terrified eyes. He kept looking toward the edge of the square where a woman, probably his mother, stood with a group of townspeople being held at rifle point by Wehrmacht soldiers. She wasn't crying. She wasn't making a sound. She just stared at her son with an expression that Müller would remember for the rest of his life. Weber handed Müller the execution order and a list of names. "Read it to them," he said in German. "Make sure they understand every word. Division wants documentation that proper procedure was followed." Müller took the papers with hands that felt very cold despite the mild autumn weather. He scanned the German text. Paragraph after paragraph of legal terminology that boiled down to one simple fact: these men would die because 2 Wehrmacht soldiers had been killed in a partisan ambush 3 kilometers outside town. The investigation had concluded that the attack was coordinated with help from local civilians. Therefore, reprisal was justified under international law. Sentence: death by hanging. Time of execution: 6 p.m. He looked at his watch. It was 2:30 p.m. "Get on with it, Corporal," Weber said. "We have a schedule to keep." Müller stepped forward. He took a breath. And he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, even though it saved 73 others. What happened next took place in the space between languages, in the gap between what was said and what was heard. Müller began to speak in Italian, and the prisoners looked up from the ground to listen. But he wasn't translating the execution order. "My name is Heinrich Müller," he said in Italian. "I am a German translator. The commander is going to ask me to read you the charges and sentence. I am required to translate your responses. What I am about to tell you is not what is written on these papers, but it is what you must pretend to hear." Several of the prisoners' eyes widened. One started to speak, but Müller held up a hand. "Do not react. Do not show emotion. If you understand, nod once." 73 heads nodded, some quickly, some slowly, but all with sudden attention. "The charges state that you are all guilty of aiding partisan fighters and that you will be executed at 6 o'clock this evening. That is what these papers say. But I am not going to translate that. When I finish speaking, I will turn to the German commander and tell him that I have explained the charges. He will expect you to show fear, to protest, to plead. Some of you need to do that. Act as if I have just told you that you will die. A murmur went through the prisoners. The young farm boy's mother, watching from the edge of the square, gripped the arm of the woman beside her. But I am going to mistranslate your responses, Müller continued. When the commander asks if you understand the charges, I will tell you to all say, yes, in Italian. When he asks if any of you wish to make statements, 3 of you must volunteer. You will say whatever you want, but I will translate it as a confession to aiding partisans. You must speak for at least 30 seconds each. Make it emotional. Make it believable. Why are you doing this? One of the older prisoners asked in Italian. Müller didn't answer the question. He didn't know how to answer it. The commander believes this is a formality before execution. He expects the procedure to take 20 minutes, 30 at most. But I am going to make it take much longer. I am going to mistranslate everything in ways that create delays, require clarifications, and force the commander to wait for paperwork from headquarters. They will discover the deception, another prisoner said. Eventually, yes, Müller agreed. But not today. Today, I am the only person here who speaks both German and Italian fluently. The commander must trust my translation. And I am going to use that trust to buy time. Time for what? I don't know yet, Müller admitted. But every hour these proceedings continue is another hour you are alive. Something might change. The Allied forces might arrive. The partisan activity might force a German withdrawal. The commander might receive new orders. I cannot promise you will survive. But I can promise you will not die at 6 o'clock as planned. He could see some of the prisoners beginning to hope, beginning to believe. That was dangerous. Hope could show on a man's face. Hope could give away the deception. You must still believe you are going to die, Müller said more firmly. You must act like condemned men. When I ask for volunteers to make statements, 3 of you will come forward reluctantly, fearfully, as if you are hoping for mercy but expecting none. Can you do that? The old man who had asked why Müller was doing this stood a little straighter. We can do that. Good. Müller turned back toward Weber, who was checking his watch impatiently. Well, the SS officer demanded in German. Have they understood the charges? Yes, Herr Hauptsturmführer, Müller replied. But there is a complication. Several of the prisoners are claiming they were not in town during the partisan attack. They are requesting that witnesses be brought forward to verify their locations. Weber's face darkened. This is not a civilian trial, Corporal. This is a military reprisal action. We don't need witnesses. I understand, Herr Hauptsturmführer. But division command specified that proper procedure must be followed and documented. If the prisoners make formal statements claiming innocence and requesting witnesses, that should appear in the report. Otherwise, it could be argued that due process was not observed. This was a gamble. Müller was counting on Weber's fear of bureaucratic punishment outweighing his desire for quick execution. In late 1944, with Germany losing the war and officers being held accountable for irregularities, even an SS man might hesitate to shortcut procedure if it could lead to questions from headquarters. Weber stared at him for a long moment. Müller kept his face neutral, professional, the expression of a clerk who was simply trying to help a superior officer avoid paperwork problems. Fine, Weber finally said. Take their statements. But keep it brief. I want this completed by 6 o'clock. Of course, Herr Hauptsturmführer. Müller turned back to the prisoners and began the elaborate performance that would define the next 3 hours of his life. At 3:15 p.m., Müller was translating the 6th prisoner's statement, which was actually a rambling story about the man's daughter's wedding 2 years earlier. Müller was converting it into a detailed confession about storing weapons for partisans and providing food to resistance fighters in the hills. Weber, who spoke no Italian, had no reason to doubt the translation. But he was growing impatient. This is taking too long, he said. How many more have statements to make? 17, Herr Hauptsturmführer, Müller lied. Actually, all 73 had volunteered once they understood what was happening. However, many are repeating similar information. I could summarize the remaining statements rather than taking them individually. Do that. We're already behind schedule. At 4 p.m., Müller introduced a new complication. Herr Hauptsturmführer, 3 of the prisoners are claiming they can prove they were in Bologna at the time of the attack. They say they have work permits from the German Labor Office that show they were employed in the city. Weber's jaw tightened. We don't have time to verify that. I agree, Herr Hauptsturmführer. However, if the permits exist and we execute the men without checking, division command might. Enough. Weber slammed his fist on the building's stone railing. Where would these permits be? The men claim they left them with the town clerk for safekeeping. The clerk's office is in this building. Then get the clerk up here. Now. Müller found the town clerk, an elderly man named Giuseppe Ferraro, hiding in a storage room on the building's second floor. He explained the situation in rapid Italian. 3 prisoners need work permits from Bologna. They don't exist, but you're going to spend the next hour searching your files very carefully for them. Ferraro, who had been certain he would be shot before sunset for his role as a town official, grasped the plan immediately. My files are very disorganized, he said. It could take a long time to search properly. Take as long as you need. By 5 p.m., the execution had been delayed to 7 p.m. while Ferraro searched his files. Weber was pacing the steps, smoking one cigarette after another, and periodically shouting at Müller about Italian incompetence and bureaucratic inefficiency. Müller agreed with everything Weber said. Yes, the Italians were disorganized. Yes, this was taking far too long. Yes, it was intolerable that a simple reprisal execution had turned into an administrative nightmare. But procedure was procedure, and wouldn't division command want documentation that every possible avenue had been explored before sentence was carried out? Weber stopped pacing. You're very concerned about paperwork for a corporal. Müller's heart stopped. This was the moment when the deception could unravel. He met Weber's eyes steadily. My father taught me that careless documentation leads to audits, Herr Hauptsturmführer. And audits lead to questions about why proper procedure wasn't followed. I am simply trying to ensure that your report to division command will be beyond criticism. It was the right answer. Weber, who had probably faced 100 audits and reviews in his career, nodded slowly. You're smarter than most translators I've worked with, Müller. Thank you, Herr Hauptsturmführer. At 5:30 p.m., Ferraro emerged from the building and announced in Italian that he had found work permits for 2 of the prisoners, but they had expired 3 weeks before the partisan attack, so they didn't actually prove the men were in Bologna on the relevant date. Müller translated this to Weber, adding, however, Herr Hauptsturmführer, the men are now claiming that they renewed the permits but the new ones were stolen during a partisan raid on the Labor Office 2 weeks ago. They say the Labor Office in Bologna would have records of the renewal. This is absurd. I agree completely, Herr Hauptsturmführer. However, if we execute them and it later emerges that the renewed permits did exist. How would it emerge? These men will be dead. But the town clerk knows about the permits now. If he's questioned later by partisans or allied investigators. Weber pulled out his pistol and for a terrible moment Müller thought he was going to shoot either the clerk or Müller himself. Instead, Weber fired 3 shots into the air, silencing the murmuring crowd of townspeople. New plan, Weber said coldly. We execute the 70 men whose innocence cannot be verified. The 3 with the questionable permits will be sent to the Labor Battalion for further investigation. If the permits exist, they live. If not, they'll be shot later. Does that satisfy your concern for proper procedure, Corporal Müller? Müller's mind raced. He had saved 3 lives definitively. But 70 men would still die, and it was now 5:45 p.m. The sun was setting. Time was running out. That is acceptable, Herr Hauptsturmführer. However, I should inform you that 4 more prisoners have requested to make final statements before sentence is carried out. It is their right under military law. Weber looked at him with something close to hatred. How long? 10 minutes each, Herr Hauptsturmführer. Perhaps 15. Fine. But that's the end. At 6:45 p.m., we hang every man who hasn't been cleared. No more delays. No more statements. No more paperwork. Understood? Understood, Herr Hauptsturmführer. At 6:15 p.m., while the second of the 4 prisoners was giving his final statement, actually a detailed description of his mother's recipe for polenta, a motorcycle courier arrived from division command. Weber read the message and his face went pale. He looked at Müller with an expression that combined fury and something else, something that might have been respect or might have been fear. "Orders from Division Command," Weber said. "All scheduled executions are postponed pending review of partisan activity in the region. We are to detain the prisoners until further notice." He folded the message and put it in his pocket. "It appears, Corporal Müller, that your excessive attention to procedure has saved these men's lives. For now. I was simply following regulations, Herr Hauptsturmführer." "Of course you were." Weber studied him for a long moment. "You are to return to your supply convoy, Corporal. I will not require your translation services any further." It was a dismissal, but also a warning. Weber knew. Perhaps he had known for hours. But he was allowing Müller to walk away. "Yes, Herr Hauptsturmführer." "Thank you, Herr Hauptsturmführer." Müller walked across the square toward the waiting supply trucks. Behind him, he heard Weber ordering the prisoners to be taken to the holding cells in the building's basement. They would live at least one more night. At the edge of the square, the young farm boy's mother caught his eye. She said nothing. She made no gesture. But in her expression, Müller saw something that he carried with him long after the war, recognition that someone had chosen mercy when cruelty would have been easier, that someone had risked everything to give her son a chance to see another sunrise. The supply convoy left Pontelongo at 7 p.m. as darkness settled over northern Italy. Müller sat in the back of a truck with 3 other soldiers who complained about the delay and the rain and the terrible Italian roads. He said nothing. He stared at his hands and thought about the 73 men in the basement of the municipal building. The order postponing executions had come from Division Command, but Müller learned later that it wasn't a humanitarian gesture. The German military was beginning to recognize that indiscriminate reprisals were turning the Italian population violently against them, making partisan recruitment easier and occupation more difficult. The delay was tactical, not moral. But for 73 men in Pontelongo, the reason didn't matter. They were alive when they should have been dead. 3 weeks after Pontelongo, Müller was transferred to a Wehrmacht unit retreating toward Germany. Italy was lost. The war was lost. Everyone knew it except the fanatics who still believed in final victory. On November 8, 1944, partisan forces liberated Pontelongo. The 73 prisoners were released. The young farm boy returned to his mother. The old man who had asked Müller why he was helping them returned to his village in the hills. Ferraro, the town clerk, carefully recorded in his official logbook that 73 men had been saved by the mistake of a German translator whose name he spelled as Heinrich Müller, because that's what it had sounded like when the SS commander said it. Müller never knew this happened. He never learned that the prisoners survived liberation. He never found out if the delay he created had made the difference between life and death, or if the 73 men would have been freed by the partisan advance even without his intervention. He carried Pontelongo as a question mark, not an answer. He had done something, but he didn't know if it had mattered. In January 1945, Müller's unit was captured by American forces near Frankfurt. He spent 2 years in a POW camp, was released in 1947, and returned to Munich to find his family's import business destroyed by bombing. His father was dead. His Italian mother had survived but was living with relatives in a single room because the family house was rubble. He never spoke about Pontelongo. Not to his mother, not to his wife when he married in 1949, not to his children when they asked about the war. When pressed, he would say only that he had worked as a translator, had spent most of the war behind a desk, had been fortunate to avoid combat. This was technically true. But it was also a lie of omission that grew heavier with each passing year. In 1983, 39 years after the events in Pontelongo, Heinrich Müller received a letter from Italy. It was addressed to Heinrich Müller, German translator, Munich, with no other identifying information. The Italian Postal Service, showing either impressive detective work or remarkable luck, managed to deliver it to the correct Heinrich Müller in Munich. The letter was from Giuseppe Ferraro's grandson, Marco. Ferraro had died in 1981, but before his death, he had told Marco about the German translator who had saved 73 men through deliberate mistranslation. Marco had spent 2 years searching for survivors who might remember a translator's name. He had interviewed 64 men who had been in the square that day. Most remembered the translator. None remembered his name clearly, but several recalled that the SS officer had called him Müller. Marco's letter included a photograph taken in Pontelongo's town square in October 1983. 26 elderly men stood in two lines, their hands at their sides, their expressions solemn. A banner behind them read, "In memoria di Heinrich Müller, Illinois tradutor che ci ha salvato," in memory of Heinrich Müller, the translator who saved us. They thought he was dead. They were memorializing a man they believed had probably been executed himself when his deception was discovered. Müller sat in his living room in Munich and stared at the photograph for a long time. 26 survivors. 26 out of 73. The others had died in the decades since, from old age, from illness, from the natural progression of mortality that spares no one. But 26 had lived long enough to stand in that square again and remember. He wrote back to Marco Ferraro. A short letter. He explained that he was alive, that he had never been punished for the events in Pontelongo, and that he had returned to Munich after the war. He did not say whether his actions had been motivated by conscience or fear or simple human decency. He did not claim to be a hero. He said only that he had done what seemed necessary at the time. Marco wrote back immediately, asking Müller to visit Pontelongo. The survivors wanted to meet him, to thank him, to show him the memorial plaque that had been installed in the town square. Müller considered the invitation for 3 weeks. He discussed it with his wife, who had known nothing about Pontelongo until the letter arrived. She encouraged him to go. "You saved 73 lives, Heinrich. You should accept their thanks." "I delayed their execution by a few hours," he corrected. "The partisan advance saved them. I just bought time." "Time is sometimes all we can buy," she said. And for 73 men, it was enough. In November 1983, Heinrich Müller returned to Pontelongo for the first time in 39 years. The town square looked smaller than he remembered. The municipal building had been repaired after bomb damage. The streets were paved now, not muddy. Everything had changed, but the geometry of the space was the same, the dimensions of the square where 73 men had stood waiting to die. 23 survivors attended the meeting. 3 others had died in the months since the photograph was taken. They shook Müller's hand. They embraced him. They called him their savior. He felt like a fraud. "I did very little," he told them. "I mistranslated some documents and wasted time. That's all." The old man who had asked Müller why he was helping them, his name was Paolo Rossi, put a hand on Müller's shoulder. "You risked your life for us. If the SS officer had discovered what you were doing, he would have shot you in that square alongside us. You knew that. You did it anyway. That is not very little." "The order from Division Command would have arrived whether I delayed the execution or not," Müller protested. "Would it?" Rossi asked. "The order came at 6:15 p.m. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. If you had simply translated the documents accurately and let the procedure move quickly, we would have been hanging from ropes by the time the courier arrived. The order would have been useless. You bought us 16 minutes, and those 16 minutes made the difference between life and death. How is that very little?" Müller had no answer. After the meeting in Pontelongo, Müller began to receive letters from survivors and their families. They wanted to share stories, to express gratitude, to invite him to weddings and baptisms and anniversaries. One letter came from the farm boy's mother. She was 78 years old now, her son was 56 with grandchildren of his own. She wrote, "When I stood in that square watching my son wait to die, I prayed for a miracle. You were the answer to that prayer. Thank you for giving me 40 more years with my son." Müller kept the letter in his desk drawer. Sometimes he took it out and read it, trying to feel the gratitude she expressed. Mostly he felt the weight of knowing that 26 men had lived but 47 had not survived to the 1980s. He wondered what had killed them. Old age? Illness? Had any died in other partisan actions after liberation? Had any been recaptured by Germans during the retreat? He would never know. He had saved 73 men from execution on October 17, 1944, but he couldn't save them from time, disease, accidents, or the random cruelty of fate that takes us all eventually. In 1985, a German television journalist learned about the story and requested an interview. Müller declined. The journalist persisted. Other media outlets picked up the story. German translator who saved 73 Italians through deliberate mistakes finally speaks out, was a headline in one newspaper, except Müller had not spoken out. He had tried to stay silent, and silence was no longer possible. He gave one interview, to a small regional newspaper in Munich, mainly to stop the larger outlets from harassing him. He explained what had happened in Pontelongo. He explained that he had deliberately mistranslated documents and statements to delay the execution. He explained that his actions had probably not mattered much because the order postponing executions would have arrived anyway. The interviewer asked him why he had risked his life for Italian partisans and civilians when he was a German soldier. Müller thought for a long time before answering. I was a translator. My job was to make people understand each other. That day in Pontelongo, I understood that if I translated accurately, 73 men would die. So I chose to make the German commander misunderstand. It seemed like a logical professional decision at the time. That's not an answer, the interviewer said. Why did you care if they died? Because I was looking at a 17-year-old boy whose mother was watching him stand in a line waiting to hang, Müller said. And I thought about my own mother, who was Italian. And I thought that if I did nothing, I would spend the rest of my life knowing I could have done something. So it was conscience. It was self-preservation, Müller replied. I was preserving the version of myself that could still look in a mirror. Heinrich Müller died in 1991 at the age of 73. The town of Pontelongo sent a delegation of 6 people to his funeral in Munich, for survivors, the mayor, and Marco Ferraro. They brought a plaque with them, identical to the one installed in Pontelongo's town square. It reads, to Heinrich Müller, whose courage in small moments created consequences beyond measure. Müller's wife installed the plaque in their garden in Munich. It remains there today, tended by the family who now lives in the house. They know the story. They show the plaque to visitors. They explain that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance, a mistranslation, a delay, a deliberate misunderstanding, can change everything. But the legacy of Heinrich Müller is more complicated than a memorial plaque. His story raises questions that have no easy answers. Was it courage or simply human decency to refuse to participate in an execution? Should we celebrate Müller for doing something that any person with a conscience should have done automatically? Is it remarkable that a German soldier tried to save Italian civilians, or is it tragic that such behavior was rare enough to seem remarkable? And what about the German soldiers who didn't do what Müller did? The translators who accurately translated execution orders. The officers who carried out reprisal killings without delay or mercy. The thousands of men who participated in atrocities and war crimes because they were following orders or because they believed the enemy deserved no compassion. Were they fundamentally different from Müller? Or did they simply never find themselves in a situation where a small act of resistance could make a measurable difference? Paolo Rossi, who survived the war and lived until 1997, wrote about this in a memoir published a year before his death. I do not believe Heinrich Müller was a better man than other Germans. I believe he was a man in a position to make a choice, who recognized the choice for what it was, and who acted on conscience rather than duty. That combination, position, recognition, and action, is rare. But it is not the rarity that matters. What matters is that it happened at all. Today, 73 names are inscribed on a memorial in Pontelongo's town square. Not the names of the dead, these men lived, at least through liberation. Rather, the names of those who were supposed to die on October 17, 1944, but did not. 47 of those names belong to men who have since died of natural causes. 26 belong to men who were still alive when the memorial was dedicated in 1983. As of 2024, 3 survivors are still living, all in their late 90s, all living in different parts of Italy, all still remembering the afternoon when they stood in a muddy square waiting to hang. One of them is Giovanni Ferraro, Marco's father, Giuseppe's grandson. The family name has passed through 4 generations now, all because Giovanni Ferraro was supposed to die at age 16 but did not. When asked about that day, Giovanni says, I remember standing in line and thinking about my mother. I remember the German translator speaking to us in Italian. I remember him saying we should pretend to be condemned men even though he was trying to save us. I remember believing he would fail but being grateful that someone tried. And I remember the moment when the SS officer read the order postponing the executions. We were already being taken to the cells. The ropes were already tied to the gallows they had constructed. We were minutes away. Minutes. He pauses, the way elderly men do when remembering moments that defined their lives. People ask me if Heinrich Müller was a hero. I don't know what that word means anymore. He was a translator who did his job badly on purpose. He lied to his superior officer. He deliberately violated his duty as a soldier. By all military standards, he should have been court-martialed. But by human standards, by the standards that matter when you're 17 years old and watching ropes being prepared, yes. He was something more than a translator that day. The story of Heinrich Müller has been told in books, documentaries, and academic studies about resistance during World War II. It has been cited as an example of bureaucratic resistance, using procedural delays and administrative complexity to sabotage unjust orders from within the system. But perhaps the most important legacy is something smaller and more personal. In 1989, 5 years before Heinrich Müller died, a young German translator named Anna Schmidt was working at a refugee processing center in West Germany. She was tasked with translating interviews of asylum seekers from Eastern Europe. The standard procedure was to translate accurately and allow immigration officers to make decisions based on the information provided. One day, a family from Poland appeared for their interview. The father was a former union organizer who had fled after martial law was declared. Their asylum claim was weak by bureaucratic standards. He hadn't been arrested, hadn't been physically persecuted, was simply afraid of what might happen if he returned. Schmidt translated the interview accurately at first. But then she heard herself adding details that weren't in the Polish man's statement. She embellished his fears, made his potential persecution sound more immediate and credible. She mistranslated deliberately, the way Heinrich Müller had done 45 years earlier in Italy. The family received asylum. They settled in Frankfurt. Their children grew up German. Years later, Schmidt confessed to a colleague what she had done. The colleague asked her why she had risked her career. "I'd read about Heinrich Müller," Schmidt said. "The translator in Italy who saved 73 people by lying. And I thought, if I'm ever in a position where I can do something similar, I should try. Even if it's just one family instead of 73 people." How many other translators, bureaucrats, officials, and clerks have made similar choices in the decades since World War II? How many have deliberately misunderstood orders, delayed processes, or lost paperwork to protect someone vulnerable? We don't know. Most leave no record. Most never speak of it. But Heinrich Müller's story suggests that such choices happen more often than we realize, in small moments, by ordinary people who simply refuse to participate in something they recognize as wrong. That is the legacy. Not a dramatic rescue or a heroic gesture, but a reminder that we always have choices, even in systems designed to eliminate choice. A reminder that language itself can be a form of resistance, that every translation is an interpretation, every interpretation is a choice, and every choice carries consequences. Heinrich Müller bought 73 men 16 minutes, and those 16 minutes became years, decades, lifetimes. Children were born who would not have existed. Families continued who would have ended. Stories were told that would have been silenced. All because one translator decided that accuracy was less important than conscience. All because, in the space between German and Italian, between what was said and what was heard, there was room for mercy. And in that space, 73 men lived who were supposed to die. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And sometimes, the most important choices are the ones made in a language no one else understands, the private language of conscience that speaks when duty is silent, the translation that happens between what we are ordered to do and what we know is right. On October 17, 1944, in a muddy town square in northern Italy, Heinrich Müller performed an act of translation that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with humanity. He took an execution order and mistranslated it into a delay. He took certainty and mistranslated it into possibility. He took death and mistranslated it, imperfectly, inadequately, but definitively, into life. The ropes were tied. The gallows were ready. The men were waiting. And one translator said, "Not today. Not in my language. Not while I still have a choice." That is the story of Heinrich Müller. A man who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing a translator can do is refuse to make people understand each other. Because sometimes, misunderstanding saves lives.